Purple Bears out there. Welcome back to another episode of Purple Bear Biology. We are going to continue our exploration of the endocrine system and dive headfirst into the complexities of tropic hormones and neuroendocrine connections. We are going to begin to explore our endocrine tissue by starting in the skull and delving into the brain. On the inferior side of the brain dangles a structure called the pituitary gland. Notice that in reality, the pituitary gland is actually divided into two structures, the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary. Cool fact! Technically speaking, the posterior pituitary gland is made of nervous system tissue that extends from the hypothalamus. Speaking of the hypothalamus, if we follow this cool structure called the infundibulum, that's kind of fun to say, isn't it? Infundibulum, infundibulum, infundibulum. Okay, sorry. If we follow the infundibulum superiorly, we come to the hypothalamus. That is responsible for secreting hormones to stimulate the pituitary gland. Working together, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland effectively regulate hormone levels from multiple tissues found all throughout the body. It's kind of crazy when you think about all of it. All of these different chemicals floating around in your blood and cells recognizing changes in homeostasis, then adjusting those chemicals in order to send messages around our body and return it back to the optimum set points. It's mind-boggling for sure. So how can we learn this? How can we begin to explore it? Let's explore this complex system by starting with how the hypothalamus and the pituitary tissue work together. First, if you look to the right, you will see the relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus makes two hormones and stores them in the posterior pituitary. When the hypothalamus stimulates the posterior pituitary, these stored hormones are released into capillary networks that feed into our primary circulatory system. Now, if we look on the right, the relationship is a little more complex. The hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary are interconnected with two capillary beds, one connected to the hypothalamus and one connected to the anterior pituitary. The two beds are connected through the infundibulum, and collectively, this cool capillary concoction is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system. This system allows the hypothalamus to rapidly communicate with the anterior pituitary gland. The rapid communication is important because the hypothalamus is responsible for regulating the anterior pituitary gland's releasal of hormones into our circulating bloodstream. Collectively, the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary tissue dramatically impacts hormone production throughout the body. Let's take a closer look at each of these hormone relationships and the hormones that they actually produce, starting the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. The hypothalamus actually makes two hormones called oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, aka ADH, and it stores them in the posterior pituitary gland. Notice that the posterior pituitary itself does not make hormones, only secretes the hormones given to it by the hypothalamus. That's kind of neat, right? So you may be wondering, well, if it's only secreting them, what do these two hormones do? Oxytocin is a hormone responsible for stimulating the uterus to contract during childbirth. As the head of the child pushes against the cervix, the hypothalamus is stimulated to release oxytocin, which travels to the smooth muscles of the uterus and causes them to contract. The cycle continues until the baby is delivered, showing us an awesome example of a positive feedback loop. But that is not all oxytocin does. It also stimulates milk to be released as the baby suckles during breastfeeding. This too is a positive feedback loop that does not self-terminate until the baby is full. As if all of that wasn't cool enough, oxytocin also has an impact on how we experience emotions of attachment and love. Ongoing research continues to explore how oxytocin may influence human behavior and social interactions. The second hormone is antidiuretic hormone, and it serves as one of the primary hormones that influence water retention to avoid dehydration from fluid loss in the urine. we will actually explore several hormones that influence water loss to regulate blood volume and blood pressure and even osmolarity of our blood. The way that this hormone works is actually pretty cool because it relies on osmolarity to retain water in our body. ADH triggers target cells in the kidneys by binding to the correct receptors in these cells, resulting in a change in the number of protein channels created for the plasma membrane. Adding more of these protein channels enables water to diffuse from the filtrate that will become urine back into the blood. Of course, the reverse is also true as well. If ADH concentrations are reduced, then the number of channels present in these cells will be reduced, and less water can diffuse back into the blood. Now, what do you think would happen to someone with insufficient levels of ADH, or even reduced ADH sensitivity inside of their cells? If you guessed that they would probably pee a lot, you would be right. And this is referred to as polyuria. It's a fascinating disorder called diabetes insipidus, resulting from when the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus cannot secrete enough ADH. Another way this disorder can actually occur is when the target cells lose their sensitivity to ADH. This is referred to as nephrogenic diabetes insipidus. To make matters worse, the lack of the hormone's effects induces the hypothalamus to trigger excessive thirst or drinking. All of that to offset the water that is being lost due to excessive peeing. One important note, do not confuse diabetes insipidus with type 1 and type 2 diabetes associated with insulin. These are dynamically different pathways. Okay, so we have the relationship between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary worked out. But what about the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland? This relationship is a little more complicated because it involves more hormones. However, once you process the regulatory behavior of the hypothalamus, you realize that the hormones released are linked to pathways, and this will make it easier to learn as well as make the neural connections to retain the information. If we start by observing the red square, we can see that our hypothalamus actually releases several hormones into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system where the red circle is overlaid. These hormones, starting from the top, include thyrotropin-releasing hormone, corticotropin-releasing hormone, prolactin-releasing hormone or prolactin-inhibiting factor, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, growth hormone-releasing hormone, or somatostatin, also known as growth hormone-inhibiting hormone. Here's another cool fact for you. Realize that all of these hypothalamic hormones that go to the anterior pituitary gland and result in changes in the pituitary gland's secretion of hormones are tropic hormones by definition. So all of these hormones that say releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone are tropic hormones. Kind of neat. Now, each of these hypothalamic hormones triggers the anterior pituitary to release or inhibit the release of associated hormones. So, for example, TRH from the hypothalamus causes the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And CRH from the hypothalamus causes adrenocorticotropic hormone to be released from the anterior pituitary gland. Prolactin, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, and growth hormone are all also influenced by their associated hypothalamic hormones. The story, of course, does not end there. Each of the anterior pituitary hormones also have target tissues of their own. Some of these hormones are tropic and influence additional hormone cascades further down the system, while others have direct effects on target tissues around the body. Okay, so that is a lot. And we'll take some time to process through those connections, but you may be wondering what causes the hormone cascades and pathways to be activated or shut down in the first place. I thought you'd never ask. There are 3 primary ways that hormone secretions can be activated or suppressed. The first one is when one hormone influences the release of another hormone. This is called a hormonal stimuli. Hormone secretions and tropic cascades are what we see with the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. These are hormonal stimuli.
Don't forget that these tropic hormones can have a stimulating effect or an inhibitory effect, depending on which hormone the hypothalamus has released. The second type of stimulation that leads to hormones being released is called a humoral stimuli. And this is when the endocrine tissue recognizes an environmental change and releases a hormone in response. A good example of this would be the pancreas releasing insulin into the blood when the levels of glucose are elevated. The last type of stimulation that we will focus on is the one that you learned when we talked about the nervous system. Neural stimuli occur when the nervous tissue stimulates the release of hormones. Autonomic nervous system stimulation of the adrenal gland to release epinephrine into the bloodstream is a good example of this type of stimuli.
Because all of that is an immense amount of information to learn and process, the easiest way I've found to learn it is to put it into a practical example by starting to look at some of these hormone pathways themselves. We are going to spend a good deal of time looking at each of the hormone pathways in our endocrine system in future videos, and some of the cool diseases that go along with them. But let's start with one of the most influential cascades that happen around our body that influence metabolism, the thyroid hormone cascade.
The thyroid hormone is responsible for helping control metabolic variables like how fast you process food, your heart rate, and even body temperature. Secreted from the thyroid gland, thyroid hormone actually comes in two different chemical structures. These T3 and T4 thyroid hormone variants will be discussed collectively as thyroid hormone in our video, but realize that T3 is the most active variant, while T4 is the most common version supplemented with synthetic drugs. T4 is usually converted to T3 when entering into the bloodstream.
Now, setting that coolness aside, the thyroid gland secretes thyroid hormone and calcitonin. You probably remember from our calcium homeostasis videos that calcitonin reduces blood calcium levels by causing an osteoblast to build bone matrix. If you don't remember that, that's okay. Never fear, previous episodes of Purple Bear Biology are here and cover not only calcitonin, but parathyroid hormone and calcitriol. For the purpose of this example in this video, let's just focus on the hormone cascade associated with thyroid hormone and not with calcitonin.
First, the stimulus for thyroid hormone releasal is typically low thyroid hormone levels in the first place. The hypothalamus recognizes a drop in the TH levels and releases thyrotropin-releasing hormone into the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release thyroid-stimulating hormone that will then enter our systemic circulation. Once inside our circulatory system, TSH circulates with blood flow until it reaches the thyroid cells with the correct receptors. Binding to the target cells stimulates the production and secretion of thyroid hormone into the interstitial fluid. Thyroid hormone then diffuses into the bloodstream, and as the TH levels rise, the hypothalamus stops stimulating the anterior pituitary gland, thus shutting down this negative feedback loop. The loop will remain off until thyroid hormone levels drop below normal again.
You kind of see that while initially a little complicated, these hormone cascades are actually pretty cool. But you may be wondering, what happens if the hormone levels do not stay at their set points? Elevated or depressed thyroid hormone levels can lead to a plethora of problems because there are so many cells with thyroid hormone receptors.
You can see some of the common signs and symptoms of hypo and hyperthyroidism in this table on the left. Notice that many of the symptoms are opposites of one another depending on whether the target tissue is overstimulated or understimulated. So, what would cause the thyroid hormone levels to vary outside of their normal ranges in the first place? There are actually several different reasons this could take place, and a common one is that autoimmune disorders tend to be the culprit. For example, individuals with Graves' disease have an immune system that actually attacks the tissue behind the eyes, causing them to bulge out. In addition to causing some pretty radical eye bulging, the immune system produces chemicals that look just like TSH from the anterior pituitary. These imposter chemicals bind to the receptors on the thyroid and cause excessive TH to be released, resulting in hyperthyroidism. A goiter often occurs when the thyroid is overstimulated or damaged. The gland can become inflamed and swells. Technically speaking, there are a lot of different causes of goiters. Outside of well-developed countries, goiters can commonly be caused by dietary deficiencies lacking iodine.
What does iodine have to do with anything? Well, iodine is necessary to create thyroid hormone.
And when our bodies have too little iodine, TH levels begin to drop. Unfortunately, the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary do not recognize that there is too little iodine to make thyroid hormone. So they continue to secrete hormones to stimulate the thyroid gland. With continuous messages from the glands in charge and no ability to produce more thyroid hormone, the thyroid gland swells and a goiter develops. These types of goiters are uncommon in the US because we have lots of foods with iodine in our diet and even have salt with iodine added. The last disease related to thyroid hormone that I want us to look at is called Hashimoto's disease. This is another autoimmune disorder, but instead of the immune system stimulating the thyroid, it attacks it and damages the tissue instead. Hashimoto's disease can be quite complicated to treat because the patient can exhibit both hyper and hypothyroidism.
Wait, what? How in the world can it exhibit both hypo and hyperthyroidism? Well, this is actually kind of neat. When the immune system attacks the thyroid cells, they are damaged and they release whatever thyroid hormone they have stored inside of them, leading to a temporary surplus of thyroid hormone in the bloodstream. This causes the patient to have hyperthyroidism. However, once the cells are damaged, they can no longer secrete thyroid hormone as effectively, leading to an eventual decline in thyroid hormone levels overall. This means that in the long term, the patient will need thyroid hormone supplementation because they will have hypothyroidism. Though all of those imbalances sound pretty terrible, and no doubt the individuals that have to live with the conditions will tell you untreated that these can be debilitating situations. But with some sliver of silver lining, everything we've talked about can be treated either with diet changes, synthetic hormones, or even thyroid inhibiting medications. These types of medications do take time to get the dosage correct for each individual because we all metabolize hormones at similar but yet still very individualistic rates. But once it's all balanced out, these individuals can live long, relatively symptom-free lives.
Okay, so let's review what we learned. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland have a complicated relationship that is vital to maintain homeostasis throughout the body. The posterior pituitary stores and releases oxytocin and ADH produced in the hypothalamus. And lastly, tropic hormones released from the hypothalamus influence anterior pituitary secretions that thus influence tissues systemically.
All right, y'all. I hope you all found that hormone network as cool and fascinating as I did. Let me know in the comment sections if you have any questions or want to explore something in more detail. Next time, we will continue our hormone pathway exploration by discussing the adrenal gland and its function in stress modulation, water management, and adrenaline secretions. As always, thank you all for watching and see y'all next time.